My wife of 27 years left me for the man whose party she planned. 11 months later, she was standing at the door of the biggest night of her career, the $70 million merger dinner she had organized down to the last centerpiece. And then the buyer walked in, crossed the entire room, past every executive, every VP, every person who ever looked past me, and put his hand on my shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "allow me to introduce our new executive chairman." And my wife's name tag said, "Event staff." If you've ever watched a man give everything to a marriage and walk away with nothing but his silence, drop a comment below and hit subscribe. This one's going to stay with you. Raymond Cole was not the kind of man who filled a room when he walked in. He was 58 years old, built like someone who had carried weight his whole life, and learned to carry it without showing the strain. He grew up in the West End of Atlanta, in a house where the heat sometimes went out in January, and nobody talked about it at dinner. That upbringing didn't make him hard. It made him precise. He learned early that a man who panics wastes time he doesn't have, and time, Raymond understood before he turned 20, was the only thing you could never earn back once it was gone. He built his career the same way he built everything, one careful layer at a time. Civil engineering wasn't glamorous work. Nobody put engineers on magazine covers or invited them to rooftop parties. Raymond designed the infrastructure that held other people's dreams up off the ground. Drainage systems, load-bearing foundations, the kind of work that only gets noticed when it fails. For 22 years, he did that work well, quietly reinvested what he earned, and never once described himself as wealthy, because he never thought of it that way. He thought of it as prepared. There is a difference, and most people don't learn it until it's too late. Diane called his career dependable. She meant it as a compliment early in the marriage. By year 15, it had started to sound like something else, like a door she was measuring for a smaller frame. She was sharp, driven, always the most prepared person in any room she entered. She had built her own name in Atlanta's corporate events world, and the rooms she entered kept getting larger. Raymond was proud of her. He told her so. But pride, he would learn, is not the same as keeping pace. And Diane had started running a race Raymond didn't know he was supposed to be in. In 2009, Raymond was offered a contract in Dubai. Infrastructure development, 3 years. The kind of work that would have changed the shape of his career entirely. The number on the table was $2.8 million. He turned it down over a Tuesday dinner without making it an event, because Diane had just been promoted and her mother had been diagnosed, and uprooting their life felt like the wrong answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. He never brought it up again. Diane never knew it existed. That was the first thing he carried alone, and it would not be the last. Her mother's house, a 3-bedroom on Campbellton Road that had been slowly losing the fight against age and a bad roof, got paid off in 2014 from what Raymond told Diane was money from an old project closing out. She thanked him, kissed him on the cheek, and moved on to the next week. The real source was a reinvestment return from a stake he held in a small infrastructure fund he had been building quietly since 1999 with a man named Walter O.C., a Ghanaian-American investor who had trusted Raymond's engineering instincts on his very first Atlanta project and never stopped calling him since. Raymond didn't explain any of that. He just made sure the roof got fixed before the next rainy season, and he let Diane believe what she believed. And somewhere in that silence, without either of them realizing it, the distance between them began to measure itself in things left unsaid rather than miles. By the time Marcus Webb appeared in Diane's orbit, a real estate developer with a sharp suit and a sharper ability to make a woman feel like the most important person in a crowded room, the marriage had already been quietly running on habit rather than heat. Raymond noticed the shift the way he noticed most things. Without drama, without accusation, just a man reading a room and understanding what the structure could and couldn't hold anymore. He didn't confront her. He didn't check her phone or follow her to events. He simply watched the woman he had built a life with slowly redirect her energy toward a door he wasn't standing behind. And he grieved it the only way he knew how. In the early mornings before she woke up, coffee in hand, looking out at the Buckhead skyline that still didn't feel entirely like his. She asked for the divorce on a Wednesday evening in March. She stood in the kitchen in her coat, keys still in her hand, like she hadn't decided whether to stay long enough for him to respond. She said she needed someone who still wanted to grow. She said it carefully, like she'd rehearsed it, like she wanted it to land clean without drawing blood. Raymond looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with the kind of hurt that needs a witness, just looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he understands completely and cannot change. He said he'd have the papers ready by Friday. She nodded. She left. And what Diane Cole did not know, could not have known, standing in that kitchen, with her keys in her hand and her mind already somewhere else, was that the man she had just called finished had a meeting scheduled in 6 weeks with Walter Osei, a meeting that would change everything she thought she understood about the quiet life she had just walked away from. The first morning after Diane left, Raymond woke up at 5:15 the same way he always had, made coffee in the same pot, poured it into the same mug, stood at the same kitchen window, watching the same Atlanta skyline go from black to gray to gold. People expected him to fall apart. His sister called every other day for the first 2 weeks, waiting to hear the crack in his voice. His barber asked careful questions with his eyes down. Even his doctor, at a routine checkup in April, asked how he was sleeping, with the tone of a man expecting a difficult answer. Raymond told them all the same thing. He was fine. And the part that surprised even him was that he meant it. Not because the marriage hadn't mattered. It had mattered more than he had words for. But grief, Raymond discovered, feels different when you've already been mourning something quietly for years, before it's officially over. He filled the space Diane left, the way water fills a space, not by force, just by nature. He started walking in the mornings, 4 miles through Buckhead before the city fully woke up. He called his daughter Simone every Sunday evening, conversations that started at 20 minutes and stretched to an hour without either of them noticing. He went back to reading, real books, the kind he used to finish in a week before marriage turned evenings into logistics. He wasn't performing recovery for anyone watching. He was simply, for the first time and longer than he could honestly remember, living at his own pace without anyone measuring it against something else. Some men lose themselves when a marriage ends. Raymond Cole found a version of himself he hadn't seen since his 30s, and he was quiet enough to recognize how valuable that was. The meeting with Walter Osei happened on a Tuesday in April, 6 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. It lasted 3 hours in Walter's Midtown office, on the 14th floor, with good coffee and a view of Piedmont Park going green below them. Walter didn't ask about Diane. He never asked about things that weren't his business. What he laid on the table instead was a proposal Raymond had not seen coming. Crestfield Partners, the infrastructure investment firm Walter had been building for over 2 decades with Raymond's quiet participation, was being acquired. $70 million. The buyer wanted the deal closed before year's end, and Walter wanted Raymond formalized, not as a silent stakeholder, as executive chairman, on paper, in the room, at the table. Raymond sat with that for a long moment. Then he asked Walter one question. He asked him why now. And Walter looked at him the way old men look at younger men who are still asking questions they already know the answer to, and said, "Because you've earned it for 15 years, and it's past time the room knew your name." Meanwhile, 11 months of silence looked very different from Diane's side of the city. Marcus Webb moved fast, the way men do when they've spotted something they want and haven't been told no yet. Within 3 months of the divorce, Diane had a seat at tables she had previously only arranged centerpieces for. Marcus's world was loud and bright and constantly in motion, and Diane, who had always been the most capable person in any room she entered, found that her skills expanded to fill the larger space immediately. She was good at this life. She told herself that often enough that it stopped feeling like reassurance and started feeling like fact. She stopped thinking about Raymond the way you stop thinking about a street you used to live on. Not with hostility, just with the mild indifference of someone who has simply moved to a better neighborhood. The Crestfield merger dinner was the crown of everything she had built in those 11 months. The client was Walter Osei's acquisition team. The venue was the grand ballroom at the Signia Hilton in Buckhead, 1,200 square feet of chandeliers and dark wood, and the kind of silence before an event that only exists when every detail has been handled correctly. Diane had handled every detail correctly. It was the largest event of her career, and she knew it. The night before the final walkthrough, she called her sister Renee and told her everything. The guest list, the florals, the 6-figure budget, the names she would be in the same room with for the first time. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she said it plainly. The way a person says something they've been building toward for months. She said leaving Raymond was the best decision she had ever made. Renee said she was glad Diane was happy. She said it once and didn't repeat it, which was its own kind of answer, though Diane didn't hear it that way. The invitation to the Crestfield dinner arrived at Raymond's house on a Thursday, a formal envelope from Walter's office, heavy paper, the kind that means someone spent money on the stationery alone. Raymond set it on the kitchen counter and left it there for 4 days. He had no interest in a ballroom full of people performing success for each other. He had spent 22 years doing the actual work and felt no pull towards celebrating it in a room where he'd have to explain himself to strangers. On the 5th day, Simone came over for Sunday dinner and found the envelope still unopened. She opened it herself, read it, and looked at her father across the kitchen table with the particular expression that daughters deploy when they have already decided what a man should do and are simply waiting for him to arrive at the same conclusion. She told him he was going, not as a question. Raymond said he didn't see the point. Simone said the point wasn't the room. The point was that he had spent his entire life building things and standing far enough back that nobody saw his hands on them, and that just once, just this one night, he deserved to be in the room when the lights came on. Raymond looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said he'd think about it. Simone knew her father well enough to know that meant yes. He RSVP'd the following morning, pressed the charcoal suit he hadn't worn since a colleague's retirement dinner 2 years prior, polished the plain steel watch that had belonged to his father, the one he wore every day not because it was expensive, but because it was his, fully and without explanation. What Raymond did not know, could not have known standing in his bedroom holding that watch on a quiet Thursday morning, was that the woman who had planned every detail of that evening, the florals, the lighting, the seating, the program, was his ex-wife, and she had no idea he was coming. Before we get to that dinner, drop a comment below and tell me, would you have gone to that room or stayed home? Because what Raymond walked into that night, nobody in that ballroom was ready for. The Signia Hilton on a Friday evening in October does something to the air inside it. The chandeliers throw gold light across the dark wood paneling, and the whole room smells like fresh flowers and money, and the particular tension that lives in a space where everyone is performing a slightly better version of themselves. Raymond arrived at 7:15, 20 minutes before the program was scheduled to begin, wearing the charcoal suit and his father's watch, and nothing else that announced him. He handed his invitation to the woman at the entrance desk, accepted a glass of water from a passing tray, and stood near the back of the room the way he always stood in spaces like this. Close enough to observe, far enough to think. He had been in rooms full of important people before. He had never needed the center of one to feel like he belonged in it. He saw Diane before she saw him. She was moving along the far wall near the event staff station, tablet in hand, earpiece in, the focused expression she wore when she was managing something large and doing it well. She looked good, confident, exactly in her element. Raymond watched her for exactly 3 seconds, felt nothing that needed to be acted on, and looked away. Whatever that chapter had cost him, it was paid in full, and he had long since stopped checking the receipt. What caught his attention instead was the man standing 12 feet to Diane's left, near the corridor that led to the private pre-dinner reception where Walter and the acquisition team were gathered. Marcus Webb. Raymond had never met him in person, but he had seen enough photographs in enough Atlanta business circles to recognize the face. What he did not expect was what Marcus was doing with that face, and that was pointing it very carefully toward a conversation he had no business being anywhere near. Raymond had spent 22 years learning how deals moved in rooms before they moved on paper. He understood the choreography of it, who approached whom, who laughed too easily, who kept their phone screen angled away from the person beside them. Marcus was running a version of that choreography right now, and he was running it badly, the way people run things when they are confident nobody in the room knows what they're looking at. He was positioned just outside the corridor entrance, close enough to catch fragments of Walter's pre-dinner conversation with the lead acquisition attorney, turning occasionally to type into his phone with the casual rhythm of a man pretending to check messages. Raymond recognized it the way a man recognizes the smell of smoke before he sees the fire. He set his water glass down on the nearest table. He walked toward Walter's corridor without hurrying, because hurrying draws eyes, and Raymond had no interest in drawing eyes. He found Walter just inside the corridor, standing with two members of the acquisition team, relaxed, unhurried, the steady warmth of a man who has closed enough deals to know that the last hour before one finalizes is not the time to become anxious. Walter saw Raymond, and his face opened into the kind of genuine smile that cannot be rehearsed. He excused himself from the two men and walked over, clasped Raymond's hand in both of his, and said it was good to have him in the room. Raymond thanked him, and then, without theater, leaned in and told him quietly what he had observed, where Marcus was standing, what he appeared to be doing, which conversation he appeared to be harvesting. Walter's expression didn't change in any way a bystander would have caught. That was the thing about Walter Osei. The older and wealthier he got, the smaller his reactions became, because a man who has seen enough knows that the most dangerous response to a threat is the one that tips the threat off before you're ready. He simply nodded once, patted Raymond on the shoulder, and said he'd handle it. Then he walked back to his two colleagues, and Raymond returned to the main ballroom as though the conversation had been about the weather. Walter made 2 phone calls in the next 11 minutes. Raymond didn't know the details of either call, and didn't need to. What he watched from his position near the back of the ballroom was a quiet, efficient sequence of events that most of the room never registered. 2 men Raymond didn't recognize approached Marcus's 2 associates near the corridor, politely, unhurried, the way professionals approach a situation they have already resolved before the conversation starts. Both associates left the building within 4 minutes of each other, coats on, phones to their ears, the practiced exit of men who understand when a room has turned against them. Marcus lasted another 19 minutes, during which Raymond watched him realize incrementally that the access he had been counting on had evaporated without explanation. Then Marcus straightened his jacket, said something to Diane that Raymond couldn't hear from across the room, and walked toward the exit with his phone in his hand and his face arranged into the careful blankness of a man who is leaving before he is made to. Diane watched him go with an expression Raymond recognized, the look of a person whose evening has just developed a crack they don't yet understand. She found Raymond 20 minutes later, because the room was not large enough for 2 people with that much shared history to avoid each other through an entire dinner service. She approached with the professional composure she was excellent at, said his name like a question and a statement at the same time, and asked what he was doing there. Raymond told her he was a guest of Walter Osei. She processed that for a moment with the careful stillness of someone recalculating. She asked if he and Walter knew each other well. Raymond said they went back a ways. She nodded slowly, glanced once toward the corridor, where Marcus had been standing an hour earlier, and then looked back at Raymond with something behind her eyes that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. She said it was good to see him. He told her the event looked beautifully done, and he meant it, because Raymond Cole had never been a man who withheld a true thing simply because the person it belonged to had hurt him. Diane thanked him, straightened her tablet against her chest, and walked back toward the event staff station. She did not look back, but Raymond noticed that her pace, so controlled and deliberate all evening, had lost just a half step of its certainty. The dinner program began at 8:45. Walter took the microphone from the host, with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with silence waiting on him. He thanked the room for being there. He spoke briefly about Crestfield, about what 22 years of patient work looked like when it finally came into the light. And then he paused. The kind of pause a man takes not because he has forgotten what comes next, but because he wants the room completely still for it. He looked toward the back of the ballroom, and every head in that room turned to follow his gaze. And the woman standing at the event staff station near the far wall, tablet in hand, earpiece in, finally looked up from her program and saw exactly who Walter Osei was looking at. Walter's voice carried across that ballroom, the way voices do when a room has gone genuinely quiet rather than politely quiet. There is a difference. Politely quiet is what happens when a host taps a microphone. Genuinely quiet is what happens when a room senses it is about to witness something it was not prepared for. He said he wanted to take a moment before the formal remarks to introduce someone. He said that in 22 years of building Crestfield Partners, there had been one constant, not a market condition, not a strategy, not a piece of luck, but a man. A man who had turned down opportunities most people in this room would have taken without a second thought, not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood that the most valuable thing a man can do with his ability is plant it somewhere, and have the patience to wait for it to grow. Then Walter said Raymond's name, and the room turned. Raymond walked from the back of that ballroom the same way he had walked into every room his entire life, without performance, without hurry, chin level, hands easy at his sides. He was aware of the eyes. He was aware of the particular silence that follows an introduction nobody saw coming. What he was most aware of, in the way that peripheral vision sometimes catches the thing your eyes aren't pointed at, was Diane, standing at the event staff station near the far wall, tablet lowered to her side for the first time all evening, earpiece still in, completely still. He did not look at her. Not from cruelty. Raymond Cole had no cruelty in him and never had, but because she was no longer the audience he needed anything from. He shook Walter's hand, accepted the microphone, and turned to face a room full of people who had no idea who he was 20 minutes ago. He spoke for 4 minutes. He had not prepared remarks because he had not planned to speak, but Raymond was the kind of man who had spent decades thinking clearly under pressure, and 4 minutes of honesty did not require a script. He talked about 1999, about a young engineer from the west end of Atlanta who said yes to a handshake from a man named Walter Osei on a project that most of his colleagues said wasn't worth the drive. He talked about what 22 years of quiet work actually looks like from the inside. Not glamorous, not linear, full of Tuesday mornings where the only reason you keep going is that you decided a long time ago that you were going to. He thanked Walter. He thanked his daughter Simone, who was not in the room but would hear about this before the evening was over, because Raymond planned to call her the moment he got to his car. And then he said one last thing. He said that everything he had ever built had been built when nobody was watching, and that he had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that a man who needs an audience to do his best work will always be limited by the size of the room he's standing in. Then he handed the microphone back to Walter, walked back toward the rear of the ballroom, and picked up the glass of water he had set down 2 hours earlier. Diane left the event at 9:40, 40 minutes before it officially ended. Raymond saw her go from across the room, coat on, bag over her shoulder, tablet tucked under her arm. Her assistant said something to her near the door, and she responded without stopping, the way a person responds when they are moving toward an exit, for reasons that have nothing to do with logistics. Raymond didn't know what she was feeling in that moment and didn't spend time guessing. What he knew was that the life she had walked away from 11 months ago had just introduced itself to a room full of people she had been trying to impress for the better part of a year. Whatever that cost her privately was hers to carry. He had enough experience carrying things quietly to know it wasn't a light load. He found out later, through Simone, who heard it from a mutual friend, that Diane had called her sister Renee from the parking garage that night, that she had sat in her car for 40 minutes before she could drive, that what she said to Renee was not about Marcus, who had not returned a single call since leaving that ballroom, and not about the job, which she still had and still did well. What she said was simpler than any of that. She said she hadn't known. She said she had spent 11 months telling herself and everyone who would listen that Raymond Cole was a man who had already reached his ceiling, and she had not known. Renee, who had always been the quieter of the two sisters, said only one thing back to her. She said, "You never asked him." And then the line went silent, in the way lines go silent when the truest thing has already been said. Marcus Webb's name surfaced in an Atlanta business journal 6 weeks later in a story about a failed competing bid on a mid-size infrastructure acquisition that had fallen apart after 2 investors withdrew, citing concerns about information handling practices. His name appeared in the 4th paragraph. There were no charges filed, no public drama, just the quiet collapse that happens when people in serious rooms decide a man is no longer worth the risk. Diane's involvement was reviewed and cleared. She had been used without her knowledge, which was its own particular kind of damage to absorb. Raymond, when Simone told him, said nothing for a moment. Then he said he was glad Diane hadn't been caught in it legally. He meant that. No condition attached, no satisfaction underneath it. He simply meant it the way a man means something when he has genuinely let a chapter close. The morning after the dinner, Raymond sat on his back porch in Buckhead with a cup of coffee and his phone face up on the table beside him. At 7:12, a text arrived from Diane. He read it once, set the phone face down on the table, poured himself a second cup. The Atlanta morning was doing what Atlanta mornings do in October. Cool and gold and unhurried. The kind of morning that doesn't ask anything of you. Simone called at 7:30, and Raymond told her everything. And he could hear her smiling through the phone, the way daughters smile when the fathers they love are finally, visibly all right. He did not reply to Diane's text that morning. He did not reply that week. Not because he was punishing her. Raymond had never been built for punishment, but because some doors, when they finally close all the way, don't need to be opened again just to prove that you've moved on. The proof was the coffee, the quiet porch, the Atlanta light coming up gold over the tree line. The life he had built when nobody was watching, standing up straight without anyone's approval to hold it in place. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Every week we bring you stories about people who kept building when the world stopped watching. You don't want to miss what's coming next.